Dobry день. Good morning. So let's start the work of our session, Translators Agency in History. I'm Oleksandr Kalnychenko, I'm the chair, and the floor is given to Anita Kłos and Mariola Wilczak. Their topic is Emotion, Collaboration and Agency in Translation History. Julia Dickstein-Wieleżyńska and Rafael Pettatsoni. So that is their topic, and few words about the ladies. So Anita Kłos represents here Marie Curie Skłodowska University in Lublin. Yes, and Mariola Wilczak represents the Institute of Literary Research from Warsaw. So, proszę pani, you are welcome.
Let's show this. In our presentation, we will focus on tracing emotion, collaboration, and agency in translation history, drawing on an extraordinary, at least in our opinion, archival resource, which is a corpus of letters of Julia Dickstein-Wieleżyńska to Raffaele Pettazzoni, dating back to the first half of the 20th century, and preserved in Pettazzoni's archive in the public library Giulio Cesare Croce in San Giovanni in Persiceto. This extensive collection of the correspondence comprises 269 items written in Italian and accidentally in German. We have been working together on this material for a while. I am preparing my PhD thesis in Polish literature history on Julia Dickstein's life and work. So I'm interested mainly in collecting biographical data. Anita's background is in Italian literature and translation studies. So she is giving particular attention to historical information on Polish-Italian literary exchange, on transnational networks of mediators, and on translational labor in the analog era. Dickstein's letters offer a unique insight into the translators' workshop in the early 20th century and provide us with knowledge on the human side of historical translation practices. However, before we present more detailed results of our research, it seems important to introduce our protagonist. Julia Dickstein-Wieleżyńska, during the short marriage with Colonel Aleksander Wieleżyński, 1926 to 1927, she started to use a double surname, was a Polish historian of literature and philosophy, poet, journalist, social, educational, and feminist activist, a cultural mediator, as well as an outstanding literary and scientific translator from or into multiple, probably 12 languages. Although she used to call herself a patriot of many homelands, her beloved cultural space was Italy. She translated into Polish the work of Giosuè Carducci, Giovanni Pascoli, Giacomo Leopardi, amongst others. Dickstein was born in an assimilated Jewish family as the daughter of Samuel Dickstein, a professor of mathematics at the University of Warsaw, and Paulina Nathanson, a talented pianist. She studied philosophy and history of religion in Berlin and Rome and obtained her PhD degree at the University of Lviv, presenting a dissertation on the work of Maria Konopnicka. Although her father was an important figure in Warsaw intellectual circles and brought her into contacts with the Polish most distinguished writers and scholars, Julia often felt underestimated both in the literary world and in academia because of being a woman and a Jew. Raffaele Pettazzoni was an Italian archaeologist and historian of religion, the pioneer of the Italian scholarship in history of religions, and one of the first scholars to propose a historical approach to the study of religion. Pettazzoni was a professor at the universities of Rome and Bologna, authored various influential studies in his field, and collaborated with prestigious scientific publishers and journals. Pettazzoni and Dickstein met in 1912 at the 4th International Congress on the History of Religions in Leiden, where Julia accompanied her father. The couple fell in love with each other and subsequently began correspondence that lasted almost until Dickstein's death during the Second World War. Julia came to Italy and for one semester studied at La Sapienza under tutelage of Pettazzoni. Even though their romantic relationship didn't work, Dickstein and Pettazzoni remained the closest spiritual friends, sharing their thoughts, works, projects, and plans. Julia's letters are, in the first place, a document of intellectual companionship, mutual support, and love of two people of science. Dickstein was a prolific translator and, unlike many of her contemporaries, did not consider translation as a secondary or less prestigious activity. She was aware of the pivotal role of translation in transnational literary and academic exchange. She pursued her profession with enthusiasm and used to teach translation to the others. As Julia's friends remembered, translation was for her a virtual source of strength and life energy. In the last period of her life, during Nazi occupation, she continued to work on translation from Ovid and John Milton.
Okay. It is my turn now. It is impossible to present here in detail Dickstein's enormous translation work. So in her correspondence with Pettazzoni, translations are omnipresent. It is impossible also to demonstrate all analytical possibilities which her letters open for translation scholars. We chose three issues broadly discussed in recent translation scholarship, which allow us to rehumanize translation history and to recognize the contribution of multiple people to the complex network of the interaction and in the making of translation. On the slide, you see some basic references, basic theoretical references, and I am quite sure you all know all these names and studies which are crucial for our talk. Emotion. It is important because of the pivotal context of love, friendship, and intellectual intimacy between Dickstein and Pettazzoni, but also because Julia used to approach translation with a real passion. However, in her manuscripts, we can spot easily a whole range of very different emotions related to her translational work. from disappointment and delusion to anxiety and anger, especially while she was in contact with unreliable publishers and collaborators, and, well, in the first place, male academics who generally tended to question her competences, to undermine them. The fragment of Dickstein letters from 1950 seems very instructive in this regard. Towarzystwo Naukowe Warszawskie, a kind of a scientific association, was trying to discredit her work as a woman translator, and her reaction was both indignation and shame. Additionally, as we will evidence in the following part of our talk, affective and bodily aspects of translation work had a great importance in Dickstein's personal history. She suffered from serious diseases of lungs and eyes, and for this reason, fatigue and illness had an instinctive impact on her work. Dickstein was always engaged in dozens of educational, literary, editorial, diplomatic initiatives, and she was constantly in contact with dozens of collaborators. However, her most important and most trusted collaborator was Rafael Pettatsoni himself. Translaboration, with this term, is the concept promoted by Alexa Alfer and Cornelius Fischenberger that brings together translation and collaboration to explore and articulate connections, comparisons, contact zones between them. It seems adequate to describe Dickstein-Pettazzoni's cooperation, which was not always focused on translation itself, but always embraced or envisioned some form of translational activity. Pettazzoni helped Dickstein with the access to the international scientific literature unavailable in Warsaw, and she, in turn, provided him with the Polish books and articles in line with his interests. The Italian scholar purchased books, journals, newspapers for Julia, borrowed her own copies. He was also her literary consultant. He recommended her interesting Italian writers to be read or translated, or even contacted them personally when it was necessary for Julia's work. The couple shared their expanding network of contacts in the editorial world and in academia in Poland and Italy. Dickstein used to ask Pettazzoni for linguistic support, for instance, when she was translating Pascoli or Carducci. He revised her translations into Italian as well as her other writings in his paternal language. In turn, Julia translated his friend's work and reviewed his books in the Polish press. We need to remember that all the communication between them and all the books, newspapers, draft exchanges were operated by traditional mail, which was also searched by customs officers on the borders or read by the censors, and naturally it slowed down enormously every work. Nevertheless, Pettazzoni and Dickstein undertook several translation projects together, and one of them was the Italian translation of Mitologia Słowiańska, the Slavic mythology, by Alexander Brückner. Following the microhistory of this translation, we will focus on agency, and we are going to underline the influence of factors which are not so often taken into consideration in historical context. For instance, translators' health and well-being and material supplies. Brückner was an eminent expert in Slavic cultures and languages and professor at the University of Berlin. Dickstein had known him probably through her parents. We know that he wrote her a letter of recommendation which granted her the access to the University of Berlin. Pettazzoni had been interested in Brückner's research for years, and he decided to publish his book in the series on history of religion he edited for scholarly publisher Zanichelli. The first mention on Mitologia Słowiańska in Dickstein letters dates back to 19, but the book was published only 4 years later. What was happening in the meantime? Why it did take so long to get the volume translated and edited? Pettazzoni hoped that the German edition of the study existed, and to proceed with the editorial process, he needed the consent, permission of the author. He obviously didn't know the contents of the book, so he asked Julia for help. But as appears, Dickstein was unable to trace and to read the copy, sold out and inaccessible in libraries in Warsaw. She was also unable to contact Bruckner, famous amongst the Polish intellectuals for his extravagant and unexpected attitudes. In March 1920, there was a military coup in Berlin, Kapp putsch, led by Wolfgang Kapp, who attempted to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And, this, of course, caused serious problems with international mail circulation. Dickstein received Bruckner's letter with the permission only in May. The political situation in Poland was also unstable in the eve of the war with the Soviet state. At the time, Dickstein was working at the press office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So when she finally got the copy of Mythologia and started to prepare the first fragment of her translation, she had to deal with the shortages of paper and the lack of access to the typewriter. She had also besides, during the war, Julia couldn't focus on translation, overwhelmed by work in the office, and depressed by the loss of many of her friends fallen in the battlefield or assassinated by Soviet soldiers. When she finally started to work on a Bruckner text, extremely demanding because of its fantastic style and of its contents full of rare mythological names and ethnographic terms totally incomprehensible for foreign readership. She accepted the assignment to translate an Arthur Conan Doyle book into Polish, obviously for economic reasons. While working on the translation, Dickstein was assisted by a family friend who happened to be one of the greatest linguists of all time, Jan Baudouin de Courtenay. He couldn't help me much, he says. There are things, gods and men, documents and places of which only Mr. Bruckner has heard or read. And then his style. He says that his book is impossible to translate, that the only thing I need to do is to drop this. Another serious obstacle appeared in February 1921, when Poland and Germany were in the state of customs war, before the plebiscite in Upper Silesia, which was to decide about the borderline between the states. Dickstein broke her glasses and was almost blind for a while. And after the book was published and received positive feedback in Italy, Bruckner demonstrated one of his famous unexpected behaviors. He broke any contacts with Julia and refused to answer her letters for no obvious reasons. To conclude, as we could see, translation processes are subjected to complex translation processes and agencies are subjected to complex interpersonal dynamics and non-human factors. The translator archives might provide us with the detailed knowledge about these human aspects of historical processes. If only we are lucky enough to find these hidden treasures. Thank you for your attention.
So is anybody from the public wants to ask questions? So it's time for questions. Can anybody from public ask questions, or shall I ask them? Thank you. So then, question on my behalf. How many languages did Julia Dickstein translate from? Is there
Probably
connection
12.
with the...
Yes, probably 12 languages.
Probably 12 languages, yes. I read that she has translated Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, perhaps from English. How do you think?
Well, we don't know this for sure. She studied Sanskrit. She had a basic knowledge of this language, and she was very passionate about it. But it's really, it's more probable that she used the English translation, the English self-translation of Tagore's himself.
Because
it was more accessible.
Ukrainian translator, professor in Sanskrit, who knew Bengali, so he translated from Bengali. Yes, and some more questions. I've read that she knew Sorbian language. How can she, where did she study it? Do you know anything about that? Sorbian language. So, can you hear me?
Yes. Well, she was really gifted in studying languages, and I think she translated for Serbian not with only the passive commandment of the Serbian language. So I think she knew some basic grammar rules, and well, it was the old school.
How do you say?
It was the old school. Certainly she was in contact with Julia Benesic. I'm waiting for Mariola to confirm. So yes. She had some contacts with the Serbian community, with Serbian intellectuals, but her translations are these are the adaptations. So she treated translation as a sort of her original work, in a way very typical for modernist writers. So knowing the meaning and knowing the basics of Serbian, she offered her own interpretation of this language. I know it might.
Yes, it's a rare language, so that's why I asked about Sorbian language. Yes, the language of people who live in Germany, mostly. Yes, and maybe there are some questions.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. I was wondering how important were personal, strong relationships for her translatorial work. You mentioned it at some point, and I was wondering if you could expand on this aspect, especially also maybe concerning her agency, like the things she could then decide concerning the translations, be that what is translated, how it's translated. You said yourself, those were very difficult texts and texts that had very many elements that were not necessarily translated already. So I was wondering how those personal relationships that were part of the work then also had an influence on that.
Well, as we said, we work on this huge, really huge corpus, and it's quite difficult to decipher. So I can say that we are, well, still at the beginning of our research. And as I said, yes, she had well, I don't know how to say, because all the letters are about agencies and networking and bringing into contact with different people, and about intercultural exchange, promoting Polish culture in Italy and abroad generally, and Italian culture in Poland. And, well, agency. I think she was very independent, despite the circumstances. And in her relationship with Pettazzoni, there is a very distinctive characteristics. He trusted her. They were respected each other. Not only she respected the eminent professor of the well-known university, but he also respected her knowledge, her interests, her approach to translation, and also to the scientific texts. So I think while working on her translation creatively, yes, she has all the powers. But of course, we can spot in this letter different histories of her conflicts with editors, who, for instance, cut off her preface to Carducci's volume of poetry, or her problems with male academics who, well, used her as I don't know, workforce, you know, as a secretary sometimes. It's brutal, put it in that way, but yes, it was always like this. So as far as editing, literary markets, university, these institutions, her contacts with institutions, yes, they were sometimes problematic, and it caused delays of many years in publishing her work, or not publishing her work, as we could see in the slide I showed you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah. You gave a lot more context. That was super interesting. It reminds me also of things that I'm not going to talk to you about today, but like these negotiations between translators and editors and so on in publishing houses, and then this the power then of the publishing houses, especially in the pre-digital era, where they could say, well, it's already in print, we cannot do anything anymore. So that's always very interesting to see, no matter how important the translators might actually be, or how well established, how well connected they are in the realms that they're working in.
If I can add the last remark, the extraordinary, well, this material is extraordinary for me because I can find in it all the information from the analog era, yes, from the pre-digital era, that we study now in translation studies, in relation to, I don't know, collaborative digital translation or audiovisual translation, shared memories, and so on and so forth. And yeah, those dilemmas, those problems were also present in a translational labor before. We don't know much about it because we usually don't have access to the archival sources. And this body of correspondence is great because, yeah, they together lived. Dickstein and Pettazzoni lived for all these, I don't know, projects, initiatives. They shared a lot with each other. So we can see it in a very precise way. And we showed you only just a fraction of what we have.
Thank you. So I believe that you have to excavate a lot. And thank you, Dziękuję. So I believe that it's time we give the floor to Rafael Schögler. Rafael Schögler, excuse me, just few words. Yes, his affiliation is University of Graz, Austria. Am I right?
Yes, this is correct.
Yes, and one form of distinction manifests of being read, cited, or referred to in speeches, that is, being a part of the academic discourse. These are words. This was belong to Raphael. Yes, in his international, in his entry to the in his chapter to the International Encyclopedia of Social and Behavior Sciences. So, a few words that he is the editor of collection, Circulation of Academic Thought, Rethinking Translation in the Academic Field. Yes, and a chapter, Sociology of Translation in the Cambridge Handbook of Sociology. So maybe this short representation will confirm citation from you, quotation from you. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I guess the most important thing to take from the introduction is that my background is in translation studies and sociology. I studied both on the MA level, then did a PhD in sociology, and then came back to translation studies. And I guess that's also something that is kind of part of the work I'm going to present today, that I entitled The Strength of Weak Ties, Exploring the Entanglements of Translators of Scholarly Books. And what I am gonna talk about is one aspect that this conference looks at. It looks at kind of this human agency in translation and interpreting, and how this kind of shapes the social and natural world. And I want to look at this in the context of scholarly book translations in Germany, or actually the German in the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, in Germany after 1945. For some, that might not yet be a real historical perspective, but for others, the societal, technological, cultural changes that have occurred since then might suffice to frame this topic as part of translation history. But more importantly, I will try to explain how the relationships and ties between different agents involved in the translation of social sciences and humanities books influence what kind of works are translated, and also influence to a certain extent the agency of different actors, agents that are involved in that process. So to start off with, I'll say a few words about networks and translation, before then concentrating on two cases, one related to like more strong ties in SSH, so Social Science and Humanities book translation after 1945, and then something about the weak ties institutionalized by publishers. So I might have to go here. Yeah, so the relationship between different agents involved in translation have long been an important topic of translation theory. To start somewhere in the 1980s, one reference could be to Justus Menteris' translatorisches Handlungsgefüge, which was often translated simply as translatorial action by scholars such as Andrew Chesterman or Juliane Noack. I would argue that this translation does actually not really include this aspect of Gefüge enough, which kind of means the structures that are actually enabling certain actions, so that are kind of enabling also the agency of those people that are somehow involved in that aspect. And if you look at different depictions of how Justus Menteris tried to show how the different roles are being taken in these translatorial actions, you can see that it's all about relationships, ties, who is close to whom, and that this has a huge influence on the translation process. Menteris then also embeds this in a much broader context that, and you don't need to be able to read all of what it says here, but that does not only include human actors, but also shows the ties of those different people involved in initiating a translation, translating a text, then maybe post-editing it, using it, and so on. But also how this is related then to different products, texts, between different aims of an interaction of transcultural forms of communication. In all of this work, Menteris stays very on a very abstract level, and is very focused on the translation as an occupation and professional practice. She does not go into all different areas of translatorial practice that you would find. It might, I guess, be difficult to use this kind of model, for example, for the cases that we have just heard before. More empirically founded and more focused are already production networks, as you can find them described by Christina Abdallah. Although, again, here, she is mainly focusing on working environments of present-day translation industry. And she's able, by looking at those networks, to explain how different types of hierarchies, connections, etc., influence translation, influence the agency of translators. Now, what I want to look at more precisely today are two specific forms of relationships that you can find between agents in the social sciences and humanities and book translations, and that are very often important to understand why book translations actually happened and why they happened in a certain way, context, and also maybe had specific effects. And to do so, I draw on Mark Granovetter's well-known conceptions of strong and weak ties. Mark Granovetter, as some might be familiar with, is a sociologist and network theorist who demonstrated that weak ties, that means weak relationships, indirect relationships, relationships that are often one-sided, that you don't know well, are often particularly important to bridge clusters of way more closely connected groups. And he says that, like, through those weak ties, new information can actually enter otherwise closed bubbles. This has been written in 1973, so long before we had the filter bubbles that we are all very well aware of when we are using social media. So kind of this kind of theory somehow fueled into the mainstream interpretation of how we communicate, I would say. And I am trying to look at how those weak ties are important for book translations in the social sciences and humanities, and how that then has different consequences. And to do so, maybe one thought about intellectuals and their ties in general. As some sociologists of knowledge and historians of sociology have said in several writings, very often intellectuals have a very broad network which goes beyond the boundaries of their immediate team, goes sometimes even beyond the boundaries of disciplines, goes beyond the boundary of what they're actually working with. And this is usually what is a very important part for their work to be successful and for intellectual ideas to circulate and to become part of an intellectual discourse. And still, when we think of translations, and I guess this was very present in the last presentation as well, we very often think of the strong ties, of the strong direct relationships, working relationships, as those being most important to actually enable a translation to take place. And this is also the first example that I will be drawing on where such strong ties were particularly prevalent. So right now I'm taking you back to the 1950s, post-World War II Germany, where scholarly activities had been interrupted abruptly by the Nazi regime, war activities, and all the atrocities towards Jews, but also other regime-critical intellectuals that were forced out of the country. And then after the war, there were a lot of translations in the social sciences and humanities that can be related to re-migration, be it temporary or long-term, of exiled scholars. And in some cases also you had translations that emerged directly within the context of the reconstructed Germany. And this is one of the cases that I'm actually looking at here, which is the cooperation of a circle of young scholars working with the later eminent sociologist Helmut Schelsky, who held different seminars where he introduced his students to structural functionalist sociology from the United States, as it says here in the German quote, not so much Arthur Parsons, but rather Robert K. Merton, who did a lot on also sociology of knowledge, but also the Kinsey reports on sexuality, where Schelsky wrote a piece against or contradicting this report, but also, for example, David Riesman's The Lonely Crowd, which became a bestseller later on. And as a result of such seminars, some of the participants in the seminars occasionally translated the works discussed there. One such example is Renate Rausch, who translated actually 3 books in her time that she was working there with or studying with Schögler. Rausch herself was trained as a sociologist and philosopher. Later on, she moved to South America, worked in the field of gender studies, built up a lot of research activities in the field of gender studies, actually, and only translated a lot, as far as I could see, in this time while she was studying in Hamburg with Helmut Schögler, who was a professor there for a couple of years. And she also actually did her PhD on US American sociology and their views on the problem of leisure and drawing on theorists such as Thorsten Veblen to David Riesman. So she was actually working on David Riesman before she translated him. In the end, she translated 3 texts. The Lonely Crowd that she took up during her PhD, the Shook-Up Generation by Harrison Salisbury, and then also a US-American take on the works of the German sociologist Max Weber. What is interesting is that all these texts got contextualizing paratexts by German-speaking scholars that were about or already had left some marks on German-speaking sociology. So René König is one of the most important scholars after after the Second World War rebuilt also sociology in Germany. And then she as well got the possibility to position herself in that process. So she was also allowed to write some introductions or prefaces afterwards and so on, where she could write something about the translations that she had written. And that's where we learned, for example, that she is connecting, like this is again a German excerpt out of a Postfast, and I'll just summarize it a bit or interpret what she's saying. And in the first part, she's kind of explaining that she's agreeing to the interpretation that Schögler, who wrote the introduction, is writing this work of David Riesman is not only affecting U.S. contexts, because actually the book is about U.S. Leisure activities and leisure interpretations of leisure at the time. But it's also something that that goes beyond that. It has a theoretical and a societal importance that can be used in the present context here. And to do so, she chose to adapt quite a few terms. She decided to replace many idiomatic expressions of the U.S. American account with corresponding German catchwords or expressions, to use German colloquial language, or where that's not possible, to kind of explain the aspects that are addressed in the translation. So she explains how she used her translatorial agency and puts that in the context of also scholarly discourses and scholarly ways of creating meaning. So I think that's a very interesting part where you can see how also these strong ties did not only enable these translations to actually take place, but also led to those translations to then have elements in them that the translator could use to position herself intellectually, but also in her translatorial work and in her interpretation of what translation actually means in that context. Then that's kind of this aspect of those strong ties, and I think we can find this very often in our work, in historical work that focuses on individual translations. The second aspect that I want to share today are so-called weak ties, and the effect of weak ties and the institutionalization of weak ties for translatorial purposes. And that's happened mainly in the 1960s and 70s when different publishing houses like Luchterhand, Surkamp, Fischer, and Hansa, as you can see on this slide, created thematic book series, or not a disciplinary book series, or they were usually not actually disciplinary. It was more topical book series, like the soziologischen Texte, Politica, Theoriereihe, Atheneum, or Anthropologie that I have mentioned here. And all those book series share that they were directed towards connecting scholarly discourses and intellectual thought more broadly, that they tried to catch a phase where universities were growing, where more and more students were coming, and so more and more people were actually buying books. And at the same time, they used they needed to create new ideas that could be interesting for those readers, and to do so, they mainly turned to the United States of America, Great Britain, and France. So they turned to translations to bring that back to our topic. This led, for example, the series of Anthropologie at Hansa to have 26 out of, 30, 33 volumes to be translations. What I'll be looking at or mentioning now in the last couple of minutes is the series called Soziologische Texte from Luchterhand, where in total about 100 works were published, of which more than a third were translations. I'll not delve into any further details here, but I want to focus on the network aspect of this series. So here on this table, you cannot see, but you could see theoretically, or when you can download it, then all the translations that were made here. What I want to show, or kind of try to depict, illustrate, is how those different, how the system worked. And I think it's worked the same way in all of these series. You had the publishing house, and the publishing house then set up teams of editors that they thought would be able to present their or to build up networks that are useful for them. And in this case, those people were Hans Maus, Friedrich Fürstenberg, and Frank Benzeler. They were all very, they were sociologists, economists, philosophers. They had very good connections within Germany, but also beyond that. So I showed here on the slide those contacts to economics, law, linguistics, philosophy, political theory, sociology. And they had obviously strong ties in between them. So the black lines, strong ties also to Luchterhand, and then weak ties to this big network that I mentioned earlier already. And this then led to this broad network that they had into these disciplines to produce translations from deceased and contemporary authors that they selected themselves. And they used their own ties to the UK, France, and the USA to, in the end, translate, I think it was 16 works from English, 11 from French, 1 from Arabic, Italian, and Polish. So you can see here already the dominance of the English as lingua franca, but also the dominance of how those networks were built up, how those direct contacts that those series editors had, how this had an effect on what was actually being translated. So to summarize that a bit, these weak ties are mainly weak ties for the publishers, because the publishers kind of use the sometimes strong ties, sometimes weaker ties of their editors to produce new ideas, to implement a translation policy. And this was kind of a very programmatic thing in that context. You can see this also in different of these series. Here is just a paratext that you can find in the Soziologische Texte, which states that these series tried to bring modern sociological thought to a German-speaking context. And they mention older texts, they mention new ideas. They don't mention translation per se. But it's very clear that without translation, all of this would not be possible. So the interplay of weak and strong ties in this last example illustrates that the nature of the ties, the objectives of translational networks and the associated interpretation of translation policy orientations depends very much on how you look at it. Like for the publisher, they actually work on with these teams to enable translations. If you then look at those individual series editors and their relationships, we'll find that it is again some strong relationships that are important, but in other cases not. I looked into some archival work at Suakamp, and there very often also series editors tried to use one direct contact, I don't know, in France to find out what was just being discussed as important works that were coming up in French sociology, and then they told that to the publishing house that this should be translated next. So a lot of this work was happening through this institutionalization of weak ties, and this was influencing the translation processes, also the agency of the translators, that I could not go into much detail now. So maybe 3 final words. In this conceptualization and discussion of translational networks, I differentiated 2 forms of social relations that then also had different effects on how academic book translations could take place and how we then also see them from the view of translation studies. Those strong and weak ties have different effects on the selection process, on the decision-making procedures, and also have different effects on how the translators can then position themselves. So I think it's interesting to kind of put this discussion on a more abstract level to understand how networks actually influence what we are looking at, depending also on where we're looking at within these networks. Thank you.
Thank you. Dankeschön. And questions, you are welcome. We have time for questions. So, can I say that weak ties is a mighty social capital? So the multitude of weak ties is a mighty social capital.
Well, a mighty social capital. Yeah, it is a form of social capital for the scholars and so on. But it's especially it is something that, if you look at the history of book translation in the social sciences and humanities, becomes important only at this point in the 1960s. Because before that, the amount of book translations were so little that it was almost only very strong ties, personal interests, personal motives, and so on, that led to those translations. And I think we also saw that in our last presentation. But from then on, from the 60s onwards, I didn't show those graphs today. I did a lot of quantitative look at this too. But from the 60s onwards, the numbers of books published in general and of book translations get so much that the individual publishers cannot oversee that anymore. They need other specialists that have this knowledge, that have those ties. And they then turn towards people that mainly have ties to France, USA, and Great Britain, which has a huge impact on what kind of intellectual knowledge is then actually translated. Right? I hope that answered your question somehow.
Yes. You know, I'm an editor of Ukrainian version of the Handbook of Translation Studies, edited by Yves Gambier and Luc van der Slaar. And as an editor of such 5 volumes, I have to look for a lot of people who specializes in this field, for example, to translate that entry. So always, yes, about 100 of people participate. So with some of them, you have very weak ties via somebody. So then I edited, yes, I work as an editor for the Russian publishing house Calibri, which is specialized in nonfiction. So then you have to address to a lot of people you do not know personally. It's very important thing to be introduced for the people to trust you. It's very important. Yes, and I would add this word, trust, which sounds today a lot. Yes, and
maybe here again now drawing not on Luchtan soziologische Texte, but on Surkamp's Theoriereihe, so another one of those series. There I could look into some of the exchanges they had within the publishing house and the series editors and so on. And they always had a very hard time to find translators. And the networks of the series editors were obviously not directed towards translators that much, right? Many of their networks were towards other scholars in their fields in other countries, but not so much to translators or people who they would trust those translations. And that's why for a very long time, the people that they then got to translate were also very close to the scholarly field. Very often they wrote PhD theses on certain authors, and then they translated something about them or people close to those areas. And then some individuals, I don't know, Eva Moldenauer, for example, she then turned into an important translator that translated many works of sociological, literary, and other genres. Right, so that's kind of how this evolves and how those different networks interplay and also change over time, I guess.
Thank you. Any questions? Maybe from the public, there are any in the hall. There are questions. I have no indications, so I'm a remote chair. No questions. So
but I've got a
thank you.
question, if I may.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yes, you said, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation in the first place. And my question is about this, this moment, 1960, when you said we can see a radical change and how we say it, from dominance of the strong ties into the dominance of the weak ties. And can we apply the same scheme or the same system to the literary translation, not only to the scholarly or scientific field, but also in literary translation?
Difficult question. Good question, difficult question. First, it's more a hypothesis.
It will be really useful for me.
Yeah, it's more of a hypothesis that this is like a very important time frame. It is. I think that those strong tie translations, or those translations emerging from strong ties, especially in the scholarly realm, they have always existed and they will always exist. And they are also more prevalent in languages where, or into and out of actually languages where not many books can be sold. So this translation from and into English is very different from any other directionalities, because those books actually also have the potential to be sold. So the publishers try to build up systems to find those books that could be relevant for them in an economic sense as well. Although they often don't make much profit. If you looked at their numbers, yeah. So, in the 1960s, what I could see is that through those books, that there were really like tons of those book series that popped up that are very thematical, and where the editors are not only like in the background doing like being there or existing, they were actually responsible for selecting the books, and they were in very close contact to people within the publishing industry. And that didn't exist in this way before that. So that's why I say that this is kind of this institutionalization of weak-tied networks. If that also happens in the literary scheme, I don't know. I would guess it happens earlier maybe already, because there is obviously way more, that's about 10 times more translations in the literary areas, I guess, than in the social science and humanities. Yeah, maybe one more comment about my presentation. Obviously, I was never talking about the GDR, but about the Federal Republic of Germany, the Bundesrepublik. I did not talk about the GDR because there the context would be different again. I think I got that wrong on my slide. Sorry.
So, I've got one more question. When speaking about the 1960s, do you take into consideration access of abstracts to translated abstract journals? In my opinion, they were very important link. Because there was a system in the Soviet Union and in America.
Union, right? Yeah.
Yes, they were of paramount importance. Pardon?
Yeah, that was mainly important, as far as I know, for the sciences, right? Like for natural sciences, medical sciences,
and for the humanities and for social sciences as well. There were special journals, so-called
in the Soviet Union, right?
Yes, and the special institutions. Yes.
Yeah.
And
within but that's more to the relationship to the Soviet Union, I would say, right? Yeah. I mainly looked at book translations. I then tried to look at also the creation of new journals that also relied a lot on translations. You can see that also in different directionalities. If you look in the United States, when the first volumes of the American Journal of Sociology, for example, which is now one of the most important journals, they had several translations in there. They translated also book reviews and so on of German books, sometimes French books. And then later on, you had the same in reverse into German. About those translations of abstracts, I would have to look into that more precisely to give you an informed answer of how important that, or how important I would say that was.
No. I don't mean the translation of the abstracts, but I mean the abstracts for the book written by the specialist, by the scholar, for example, in the Soviet Union or in the United States. So, I mean, first of all, those people. There were special institutions, special research institutions it was the only duty for them, just to review and to make abstracts for the people, for the scholars to read them and try to make the copies, to order the copies. It was a very important link in scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the time for the discussion is over. Thank you very much indeed, and for your amazing paper presentation. And now is the turn of Martin Kubuš. Dr. Martin Kubuš works for, yes, he is the host today, so he works for the University of Matei Bell. Am I right? Yes, and the only thing that I know about him, yes, I know that he is interested in translation of English literature, including old Anglo-Saxon literature. Yes, and am I right? And I know that he is the author of several books of fiction, and he's a notable fiction translator in spite of his young age. Am I right? How many books have you translated?
Thank you. Well, I have translated so far on 20 books. I finished the 20th yesterday, actually. I have to reread the text before I send it.
So congratulations. So you are welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes, so as has been said, I'm interested in Anglo-Saxon literature, which I also teach at our department. Of course, I teach it through modern English translations. Of course, I don't speak Old English myself. Yeah, these days I study certain Anglo-Saxon translations, or should I say Anglo-Saxon adaptations of biblical texts, and that's why I picked the topic Judith in the Bible and in the Old English poem. Well, it's fascinating when you compare the biblical text of the book of Judith and its Anglo-Saxon adaptation. And one of the editors of the new version of the Bible, of the King James I Bible, says that the Judith's tale is very popular even among painters. They say the story of Judith's cutting off the head of Holofernes, the Syrian commander, is second only in popularity to the similar beheading of John the Baptist, the subject for painters. Well, and definitely it's a fascinating reading for all of us, even for feminists. Yes, the Book of Judith is a great feminist work. The main character is a woman who is very strong and who helps her people to survive. So I will briefly introduce both the text, the biblical original Book of Judith, and then the Anglo-Saxon translation, or should I say adaptation. So the original Book of Judith was written in the Hebrew language. The name Yehudit means a Jewish woman. By the way, Judith is a very rare name in the Bible. Scholars say that it appears only twice in the whole volume. And that's here in the Book of Judith once, and then in one of the books of the Pentateuch. The very rare name, it's more symbolical than realistic, as the whole text, by the way. It was written sometime in between the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 1st century BC by an anonymous Jewish writer. The prestigious Slovak biblical scholar Josef Heriban says that the original Hebrew text is not preserved. There are only 3 Greek versions and some Hebrew adaptations of the book. Whereas St. Jerome himself, in the introduction to its translation, said that since it was written in the Chaldean language, it is counted among the historical books. Well, back then, of course, he didn't have that much information as we do have now. He considered that historical. Now scholars say that the book is not historical, it's only symbolical, basically, because a historical novel must be at least partially realistic. It could be a fictional story, but it must be set in realistic setting, while this is not the case because the names mentioned in the book don't match with the periods when the people really ruled or tried to rule Judea, as is mentioned in the book. For example, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was not an Assyrian king, but was a Babylonian king, for example. So these details don't match. But Jerome back then in the 4th century considered that a historical book. Well, the Anglo-Saxon version comes from the 10th century. We of course don't know the exact year. It was a turbulent period, we know that. It was written by an anonymous English writer, of course in Old English, or Anglo-Saxon as we call it. And only one version is preserved today, and that is the one found in what we now call Cotton manuscript. That's the manuscript found in the British Library, the British Museum. Maybe you know it better because it is also the manuscript in which we can find Beowulf, probably the more famous Anglo-Saxon text. Well, of course, the text of Judith is not complete. Scholars agree that probably 100 lines are missing, which probably is due to the fire which damaged the whole collection, the Cotton collection, in 1731. Of course, back then many texts disappeared and many texts were damaged. For example, Beowulf also was damaged. Some lines were lost, never to be found again. St. Jerome, in the introduction to Judith, says, I will quote about Judith, but since the Nicene Council is considered to have counted this book among the number of sacred scriptures, I have acquiesced to your request, or should I say demand, and my other work set aside, from which I was forcibly restrained, I have given a single night's work, translating according to sense rather than verbatim. I have hacked away at the excessively error-ridden panoply of the many codices. I conveyed in Latin only what I could find expressed coherently in the Chaldean words. Receive the widow Judith, example of chastity, and with triumphant praise acclaim her with eternal public celebration. For not only for women, but even for men, she has been given as a model by the one who rewards her chastity, who has ascribed to her such virtue that she conquered the unconquered among humanity and surmounted the insurmountable. Jerome spent only one night translating that, which is astonishing, considering the fact that the book has 16 chapters. It's astonishing feat overnight, I would say. Well, it's difficult to label its genre. Well, the English version is an epic poem, we may say, but the original is debatable, as I said. It's not a historical novel, because the facts don't match with the names which are mentioned in it. Heriban, the Slovak biblical scholar, says terms like fiction, historical novella, doctrinal text, apocalyptic and prophetic allegory, parable or midrash define only some aspects of the text, but neither defines the genre of the book accurately. Yes, I think that's aptly said here. Well, midrash could be partially, it's a midrash. Midrash is a text basically which could be completely fictional, but it's there to strengthen the people, the Jews, of course, in their belief, and also it reaffirms other biblical texts by alluding to them in the text. So here in the book of Judith, for example, there are allusions to Exodus, for example, when the author mentions the fact that those who pray and those who are faithful definitely will conquer the enemies. And they mention Moses and the Israelites escaping through the parted Red Sea. And because they were faithful, the miracle happened and they could part the Red Sea and escape their, let's say, enslavers, the slave owners of the Egyptians. Well, as I said, in the English version, it's a typical Anglo-Saxon poem, we may say. It is written using the head rhyme technique, as the alliterative verse, which included 4 main stressed syllables, an arbitrary number of stressed syllables divided by a caesura. Well, that was the standard. You can see the picture there in my presentation, how it looked. You can see these consonants being there, reappearing and following one another in the particular lines there, this alliterative rhyme, as we call it. Well, today the Book of Judith is still considered canonical by Catholics, but we call them deuterocanonical books. Heriban says that the Book of Judith is not included in the Jewish canon, but Jews favored it as an edifying piece of literature. The Apostolic and Church Fathers in the first century used and quoted it as the Holy Scripture. Doubts concerning its canonical status arise from Jerome's negative attitude, for he, under the influence of some Palestinian rabbis, did not value the book enough. The book was affirmed by the Synod of Hippo and the Council of Carthage, as well as by the Council of Florence and the Council of Trent. Of course, the Council of Trent here was important because back then the Church had to reaffirm the status of the book, because at the same time Protestants, or these proto-Protestants, would exclude some of these books from the Bible altogether. And why, I will say in a second, because they didn't find the books canonical enough, or they found them too superstitious, they found them too Catholic. So Protestants considered the Book of Judith a part of Apocrypha. The term Apocrypha, I will quote, meaning hidden, was applied to these books by the German reformer Karlstadt in 1520, and reflects the belief that these books contain difficulties or secrets to be revealed only to the initiated. Well, and I will again quote from the same editors of the Protestant Bible, the King James I Bible, the authorized version as we call it. I will quote, in the 16th century, parts of the Apocrypha offended reformers by appearing to support medieval Catholic practices. And though Protestants continued to accept the apocryphal books as valuable, they were denied canonical status. Calvinist, Puritan, and Presbyterian Bibles excluded the Apocrypha altogether, while Lutheran churches, like the Roman Catholics, kept it. Yes, and also the version of King James I included Apocrypha, and later in the 19th century, when Catholics became too emancipated in England, these books, these Apocryphas, were completely God-ridden of, we may say. What do we mean by these medieval Catholic practices? It's a good question. If we read the Book of Judith, I'll quote, it goes like this. Then every man of Israel cried to God with great fervency and with great vehemency did humble their souls, both they and their wives and their children and their cattle, and every stranger and hireling and their servants, bought with money, put sackcloth upon their loins. This probably reminded the Protestants of Catholic monks in monasteries. And then Judith fell upon her face and put ashes upon her head and uncovered the sackcloth wherewith she was clothed. And about the time that the incense of that evening was offered in Jerusalem in the house of the Lord, Judith cried with a loud voice and said, and so forth. So when they saw the word ashes, sackcloth, and of course incense, that was for them too Catholic. So that's why Protestants actually found the books too superstitious and too reflecting the faith of the old believers. So they had to get rid of that if possible. Well, of course, I argue in the text that this text, Anglo-Saxon Judith, is not a translation, it's an adaptation. And of course, here you have to define adaptations as such. So I will, because time flies, quote only the second definition. So adaptation, as a term traditionally used, is used to refer to any target text in which a particular free translation strategy has been adopted. The term usually implies that considerable changes have been made in order to make the text more suitable for a scientific audience or for the particular purpose behind the translation. Well, of course, Judith was rendered by many translators or by priests, For example, Aelfric the Grammarian, who also did his own translation, and that was rendered for political purposes, because the time when it was made, it was a very turbulent time. It was the 10th century. The English were fighting the Vikings, and even Vikings in coalition with Strathclyde Celts and with the Scottish. Think about the Battle of Brunanburh, the famous poem which describes the King Athelstan, the Anglo-Saxon king, forging unified England, fighting the Vikings and the Scottish and so on. So probably the political function was there, but also I would argue that this text also is a typical enculturation text, enculturational adaptation, should I say. To define enculturation, I will quote John Paul II, the former Pope. He says that enculturation means the intimate transformation of authentic cultural values through their integration in Christianity and the insertion of Christianity in the various human cultures. Well, so it's like a blending of values. New things are introduced and old things are reaffirmed, so they feel natural, so they feel as natural parts of this new culture. I will show you specific examples on Judith very soon. Well, I would say, as I said, that Judith in Old English is a typical enculturational adaptation. It is a narrowing adaptation because it's much shorter than its original. Again, as I said, the original book of Judith, as we know it from the Bible, consists of 16 chapters, whereas the poem only has 350 lines. But it's put into a recognizably Germanic cultural setting. I will explain in the next slides why specific Germanic cultural setting. As I said, Popovich would say that it's a narrowing adaptation. The original invariant information of the source text is narrowed down here dramatically, I would say. And in terms of intertextuality, it is an interliterary adaptation. As Žilka says, an adapted work is on the borderline between the original text and the new text. It is a result of two principles, the creative principle and the retentive principle. So something old must be there, so it's accepted by the culture, which is enculturated, and something new must come to really enculturate it. Well, so here I would take the liberty and I would define enculturational adaptation. So an enculturational adaptation is a text written in such a fashion so that it integrates Christianity into the target culture and transforms the original values of the target culture by their integration into Christianity. I will write more in my paper, which I'm working on. And here I would, this is the last slide, time flies really. Well, I would define two types of enculturation or enculturational elements. I call them primary and secondary elements. Primary ones are those which are part of the source culture, the new ones, the foreign ones. In our case, in the case of Judith, it's the Christian features or Judeo-Christian features. Well, first of all, we have to ask ourselves a question, why do we speak about enculturation at all when we speak about Book of Judith? Enculturation is a term from Christianity. We know that Judith is an Old Testament book. Well, the answer is very simple. This Anglo-Saxon anonymous adaptation is Christianized. So there are certain points in the text, certain elements, which could be called anachronisms, which never could have been parts of the Jewish culture. I'll be very specific here. For example, in this Anglo-Saxon translation, the term savior is found. In Anglo-Saxon, it's nergend, savior, yes, which is a typical Christian term, not a Jewish term. It's found 3 times there, line 45, 73, and 81. Then, for example, which is very interesting, the rines is also found in line 86, Trinity. Trinity, again, a Christian concept. The God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which was not found in the Old Testament. And also Mayeth, pardon my Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, Mayeth, which is found 4 times in the text, meaning maiden. This is very interesting because in the book of Judith, Judith is a widow, as Jerome says in the beginning. She's a widow. She lost her husband, but she remained chaste. She never remarried, and she was very faithful to her Lord, so she managed to conquer her enemy. Here, in the Anglo-Saxon version, she's Christianized by being made into a virgin. So there's no husband mentioned. The word widow is not there. Judith is a maiden. And the word mayeth is defined in the Anglo-Saxon dictionary as a maid, virgin, girl, maiden, woman. So actually she is turned into a virgin. These were the new things which came into Anglo-Saxon culture, and the secondary elements, as I define them, are the old elements, the known elements, which are perfectly understandable for the enculturated culture. So they are felt part of Christianity, which is coming to the culture. And I divide them into 2 groups, semantic and formal. Concerning the semantic elements, I would mention details which, of course, are not found in the original book of Judith. For example, Judith and her reward. When she helps her people to conquer the enemies, the Syrian army, she's given certain things as a reward. In the original text, she's given domestic utensils, but in the Anglo-Saxon version, she's given weapons and weaponry, which is very interesting. So, as in Anglo-Saxon literature, as in Beowulf, for example, she's given a helmet, a sword, a mail coat, a shield, and so forth. Something typical of Anglo-Saxon poetry. And of course, beasts of battle are mentioned there. Yeah, so like eagles, wolves, and ravens are mentioned as those beasts which wait somewhere for the time when the battle is over, so they can peck on dead human bodies. Concerning formal secondary elements, I would mention the fact that whereas the book of Judith originally was narrated by this omniscient narrator, here it is narrated through the first person unreliable narrator, because twice he says, I have heard that, I have heard that. So it's perfect for Anglo-Saxon scopes to recite the poem, probably using a lyre, whatever they use to accompany their recital with. And of course, there are Anglo-Saxon kennings found everywhere in the text. I will just mention God, for example. When God is mentioned, it doesn't say like, and then God said, God thinks, or she prayed to God, but it says she prayed to God, to the judge of glory, the majestic guardian, the Lord, ruler of hosts, and so on and so on. So all these Anglo-Saxon compound epithets are used profoundly in the text. This which is typical, I would say, typical secondary formal feature of enculturation here. Of course, I will write much more in the paper, but I shouldn't speak more because time flies. So I hope to write the paper and later write a book in which I will provide our Slovak readers with my own translations of the Anglo-Saxon texts. That's my plan. Well, thank you for your attention.
Time for questions. You are welcome. Okay. Are there any questions immediately in the hall? Okay, so I've got several questions, if you don't mind. So, are there any paratexts? Are there any paratexts surrounding this text of Aelfric the Grammarian?
Well, yes, this version I'm talking about might have been written by him, but there is no consensus, so that's why later I changed the title of the paper. So it's not by Aelfric, but it's like by an Anglo-Saxon poet. But Aelfric himself is known to have rendered his own translation of that text, and also he wrote a sermon. So we know a lot about his version and the reason why he picked that text. We don't know much about this version I translate for my paper, this anonymous Anglo-Saxon version. We don't know much about that. We just have the text itself, and even that is not complete. So whatever we may infer directly from the text itself.
Questions? Pardon?
Hope I answered the question.
Mhm. Okay, so no questions.
Thank you.
So there is a question. I can't understand. Are there any questions? Aha, so if there are no questions, I have one more. If you don't mind me putting the question. So, don't you think that the author or the adapter or the appropriator or the reconstructualizer of this text tries to avoid abstract things? Just that is why he uses these things, the realias known to the people around him. I mean, the things like mail, etc., dealing with the things, just the real things, the objects known to people, and tries to avoid abstract things, abstract ideas, or the things that are unknown to the people.
Yes, that's true. He definitely, as I said, it's a narrowing adaptation, so he omitted a lot. If we compare it with the original book of Judith, he omitted a lot of details. He even narrowed down the number of names, proper names. Only Holofernes, Nebuchadnezzar, and Judith are found in the Anglo-Saxon version. All the other, let's say, realia or proper names are not mentioned there at all, probably to make it easier for the bard to recite and to remember all the important details. So yeah, he narrowed it down, and he also excluded certain probably elements and features which would not be necessary for the target Anglo-Saxon reader. Also, which is interesting, that the text of Judith, even though we know that 100 lines are missing, the text starts at the moment when Judith already is in the camp of the enemy, when she's about to take part during the feast of Holofernes, we may say. So the whole beginning of the book is not there. We may even say that this Anglo-Saxon version starts in medias res, as we say. The whole long beginning, this, let's say, historical, pseudo-historical narrative is not there at all. So I would say you are right. Certain things were deliberately omitted. So the text is, in an easier way, approachable and is like accepted by the target audience easily.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Very much indeed. If there are no questions, no? So, no. Okay. So I received confirmation that there are no questions. So once again, thank you everybody. Thank you all the speakers. The speeches were, in my opinion, amazing. So our session is closed then. Thank you. And thank you, the organizers, certainly.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for organizing as well from my side.